Hi everyone, my name is Mario, and today I want to show you how I built this table.
I started off by using 8 rough sawn boards that I got from the big box store for $1 a piece. These were 8-foot 1x6s. One side was very rough and the other smoother. I wanted them all to be the same thickness, so I passed them through the planer with the smoother side up, that way it took less passes to clean it up. I also realized that not all the boards were the same width, so I passed them through the table saw to make them all the same width.
So now, because I don't want to glue the boards edge to edge only, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this piece of OSB, place it on the bottom, and glue the other boards on top and edge to edge. That way it'll add some rigidity. The only tricky part is that this piece of OSB is not the final width of the table, but that's perfectly fine. I'll be able to fix that at the end.
Due to the pattern I was going for, I took one board, measured the end length, and then I found the midpoint of that side. Repeated the same with the adjacent side using the same dimensions. Then connected those two midpoints. This line is actually the midpoint widthwise, and it's what's going to help me keep the pieces straight by using it as a reference line. I then found the midpoint of the OSB, aligned the line on the piece over the line on the board, and then clamped it down. The center line on the OSB will be used as a reference point where I'll measure 16 inches away to get a rough estimate of how long each piece should be. At this point, I had decided that the final width of the table was going to be 32 inches, so I measured 16 inches from the center line. The inside pieces will measure roughly 30 inches, then I'll later add the edge trim, which will add about 1 inch on each side. I proceeded to cut the first few pieces, using the first piece as a template. Thankfully, I was able to get 4 pieces per board with very little waste. One thing I will emphasize is to make sure your saw is really at 0 when making the straight cuts. Otherwise, the pattern may be off once you get to the other end of the table.
Alright, so I made a little boo-boo. What I did was I put this piece over the good side of the board, so I ended up replicating the same piece over and over and over, which means these all have the same profile going that way. So I can't really use it this way because this is the bad side. But this is the way that I want to go. In order to fix this, I'm going to flip this over on its bad side and then use this guy. So when I cut it, the angle is going to be cut here. That means that the board, when it's faced this way, the cut is going to be the way that I want it to be.
This was an issue for me, but if you're using regular boards with both sides surfaced, then this shouldn't be an issue for you. When I reached the other end, I took a straight board and made a line slightly beyond what is going to be the end of the table. These pieces don't have to be exact, because once everything is put together, I'll trim the end as well. With the front, it was the same. I just found pieces that fit well together and ones that didn't have any gaps. To keep track of where the pieces will go, I marked between the boards to later match them up.
Alright, so there was a slight change of plans. Last night when I was driving back home, I saw a few sheets of OSB and some 2x4s on the side of the road. I brought some of those back home with me, and I realized that those sheets are wider than the one that I was using earlier in the video. Having a wider board that can later be cut into a smaller size is better than one that is narrower than the actual final size of the table. So the plan is I'm going to put it on the flat surface in the garage because I can't do it outside because my shed is full of junk from the tree falling through the roof, and I can't really put it on the sawhorses because it's going to bow. I really want a flat surface, and the concrete is a good reference point for that.
Before I glued the boards up, I dry fit them together to make sure all the pieces fit well and to expedite the gluing process. But
I don't know what happened here, but apparently I cut this piece too short, even though I know this piece belongs here because I had the markings right here to keep track of it. I don't know how that happened, but thankfully I do have a leftover piece that I can pop in there more or less like that. And later, I'll be able to trim off the X's and use this little piece for this corner and possibly for the back. I was like, what the bleep? Thankfully, I was able to fix it.
Okay, after that near miss, my little helper and I started to glue the pieces to the OSB. At first, I used the squirt bottle, but then we realized it was taking a little too long. To speed up the process, I just took the big bottle of glue and poured it in sections of 2 to 3 boards at a time. Because I wasn't using screws and didn't use clamps because I couldn't, I ended up using granite blocks from the backyard. I only needed them on each board until the glue set enough that it wouldn't allow the boards to shift. After the glue had dried, I took the whole thing back outside and used a straight piece of wood as a guide for the circular saw to trim off the ends of what is now the tabletop. For the long sides, I used a square to make sure the cuts were going to be perpendicular to the ends. As a guide, I used a used OSB board I had in my shed, but because that board wasn't straight, the waviness transferred over to the tabletop. Well, I took the piece I just cut off because that actually was straight on one side and used it as a guide to really get those edges straight. I took another 8-foot board and planed it down so I can cut it into strips and use it for the edging. What I did was use the same thickness as the boards on the table to determine the width of the edging. Here, I realized that my board was shorter than the table length, but I figured, no problem, I'll just trim a few inches off the back end of the table. So I did that and then went back to clamp the edge before I attached it. I forgot to account for the OSB under the pieces when I cut the edging. This time I measured the tabletop thickness along with the OSB and compared it to the thickness of a 2x4. The 2x4 was thicker, so I used it for the trim. But before that, I ripped off the rounded corners and then cut the edge strips. To determine the length I needed, I cut one 45-degree miter on one end. Then, I clamped the edging to the table, went to the other end of the table, and marked where the corner of the tabletop met the edging. I cut a 45-degree miter on the other end and then attached it to the table edge using glue and brad nails. I repeated the same steps with the 3 remaining sides. Measure, cut, glue, and nail. After assembling the tabletop, I moved on to the legs. Believe it or not, these legs cost me around $3. I found 3 10-foot 2x4s with the orange paint on them, which is $1 a piece. From each long piece, I cut 3 shorter pieces that measured around 30 to 31 inches. I then set the table saw to only cut the round edges off the smaller 2x4s. Those 3 long 2x4s yielded 9 smaller pieces. Now, the trick was to use as many as them to make the beefiest legs and to also make sure I was able to get 4 legs out of them. First, I stacked them horizontally by 2. Then I measured the thickness of the 2 boards to calculate the maximum width if I cut out the legs from this block. I measured roughly 3 inches, and there was enough to get 4 legs. The other orientation I tried was to prop all the 2x4s vertically. Now, the width of one 2x4 will determine the width of the leg. In this case, the width was about 3 1/4 inches, and it also yielded 4 legs. I went with this orientation over the previous. I glued the 2x4s together and used a ton of clamps to keep them aligned. The glue was starting to dry by the time I finished clamping the 2x4s, so I scraped some of it off and then used a damp rag to wipe off the excess. I don't remember if I let it dry a day or so, but then, oh wait, I'm still wearing the same shirt. Must have been only a few hours. I set the table saw to the correct dimensions and then I started to cut the leg blanks from the block. I cut each leg in one pass, but I probably should have done it in 2 passes. I then passed each leg again through the table saw to square them up a little. This time I did each side in 2 passes. Before I cut the legs to the final length, I decided to make a tapering jig. I used a 1x3, a door hinge, some screws, and a couple of pieces of plywood. It didn't have to be pretty, it just had to get the job done relatively well. After making the jig, I cut the legs down to their final length of 29 inches. Dang man, 3 cuts to cut through? After this, I looked at all the sides of the legs and the 2 least nicest looking sides were going to be faced inward and also get the taper. To determine the taper, I measured about ½ an inch from what would be the vertical edge and then about 12 inches up on the leg on the edge. I connected both points with the straight line so I could use it to make the final adjustments to the tapering jig. Once I had the jig adjusted to the correct angle, I screwed on a piece of plywood so that it can prevent the jig from opening or closing. It also served well as a handle. When I was cutting the taper, I did it in 2 passes. It also helps to keep track of which side of the leg you're tapering first so that when you rotate the leg, the taper is on the top. If it's on the bottom, it's a little trickier to cut because the leg will want to rock when you apply downward force. After all the legs were tapered on the sides, I used the belt sander again to get rid of any burn marks and any other imperfections. When the legs were sanded, it was time to attach them to the table. I used the scraps that were cut off the legs and used them as markers for where the legs were going to be. It also helped with determining the overhang of the table and the placement and length of the aprons. I figured with the table this size, an overhang of 3 inches would look good, so I traced around the scrap block to keep track of where to put the actual table leg. To determine the location of the apron, I just measured ½ an inch inwards from the table leg. I did this with all 4 sides of the apron. I did a dry fit to see if the position and proportions look good. Guess it did, because right after that, I started to drill pocket holes into the aprons. I drilled 2 on each end, and then 1 every couple of feet or so on the sides. I first attached the short aprons to the legs. I used the method I saw in one of David Picciuto's table making videos. Thanks, David. Check it. Thankfully, I had decided on a ½ inch offset because what I used for spacers were pieces of ½ inch plywood. To attach the long aprons, I stood up the legs and clamped the spacer vertically. After that, I measured the distance between the long aprons near the legs so I can cut out the stretcher for the middle part of the table. Once the table legs and aprons were screwed onto the tabletop, I made corner braces for the legs. First, I cut a 45-degree miter on one end of the board, and then placed it on the corner where it would go and mark where the other 45-degree needed to be. I then used that piece to cut out 3 more pieces. Adding these braces to the legs gave the legs more rigidity and make them less wobbly. Eventually, I'm going to replace that long screw with a lag screw. Now I finally had something that looked like a table. The next step was to sand it with 80 grit paper using the belt sander. This helped with some of the slight misalignments and to get rid of any markings on the boards. After this, I hit it with 220 grit using the palm sander. The goal wasn't to make it perfectly smooth, it was just to knock off a few of the marks left by the 80 grit paper. This way it would give the top some character. The last thing that needed to be done was to remove as much dust as possible before adding the finish. I went with a dark walnut Danish oil because that's the color we were going for. After about 3 to 4 coats, the table was finished.
Thanks for sticking around. If you like what you saw, please don't forget to like, comment, and share. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe. That way you don't miss any future episodes. See you next time. Hi everybody. Today, my puppy's gonna show you how he built this table. Already done so, please subscribe. That way you don't miss anything.
Clap your hands, Poppy!
Huh? Okay, ready? Thanks for sticking around. If you like what you saw, please don't forget to comment. Dang it. Ready? One more time. Ready?
Clap again!
Clap again. And share. You're a little booger. Okay, that should be good.